Hello, everyone. Good morning in Canada, and welcome once again to our Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar today. We are privileged to have Dr. Jane Atetin and Professor Sarah Skerrett to be our presenters today. Before we start, we would like to do a couple of housekeeping, and we will urge our attendees from remote places who may not have a strong internet connection to reconnect once again with the Zoom ID that we're giving to them, because interactions may occur. And because Zoom is a web-based format, interactions do occur sometimes. So do log in again with the Zoom ID which was given to you. And copies of this recording will be posted on our RPLC YouTube channel, so we could all have access to it after this webinar. And a short survey would also be sent out after the webinar. So before we start, I will introduce to you Dr. Jane Atetin and Professor Skerrett. Dr. Jane Atetin is a manager and policy researcher in Scotland Rural College Policy Centre. Jane has been researching rural and regional development issues for over 15 years, and she's also been working for both academic and policy organizations across the UK. Jane's main areas of interest are rural economies and businesses, rural policies and policy-making processes, and rural community change. Professor Sarah Skerrett is a professor of rural society and policy director of the Rural Policy Centre at the Scotland Rural College. Professor Sarah is editor of Rural Scotland in Focus 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2016. Professor Sarah has almost spent 30 years of her experience in analyzing the differences between policy vision and experience on the ground in rural areas and communities. Her work focuses particularly on rural community development, policies and strategies, as well as initiatives led by communities themselves. She's also been exploring issues of resilience, capacity building, and leadership. And she is currently on partial secondment to Audit Scotland. So if you want more information from our presenters today, we could have them from the flyers which were being sent to us, and you could just click the link and then you could find more information from our presenters today. So before we start, we all know the importance of rural policy, and we are all privileged to have Dr. Jane Atetin and Dr. Sarah Skerrett to give us more insights in rural policy in Scotland. So just for our listeners and viewers to know, the RPLC and RDI organized a State of Rural Canada webinar which discussed policies relating to rural and remote Canada, and also topics relating to the changing demographics, policies relating to agriculture, and also industrial restructuring. And we also know the involvement of federal, provincial, and local government participation in rural policies in Canada. So of all these, a universal rural policy, which is seen to be across board, is the rural out-migration. And recent Statistics Canada report released for the 2016 census reveals that bigger centers have growing populations, whereas smaller centers are experiencing a decline in population. Just as we all witnessed here in Brandon. Brandon is a big center in Canada, and it saw a 6.1% increase in her population. So these issues are pertinent when it comes to discussing rural policies. So we would have Dr. Jane Atetin and Dr. Sarah Skerrett give us more insights in rural policies in Scotland. So, Dr. Jane, over to you.
So over to Sarah, who's going to kick off. Many thanks, Orthis, and to everyone listening for the very kind invitation to present and share our learning with the Rural Policy Learning Commons. We would like to tell you about our Rural Scotland in Focus Report 2016 and how we have been informing rural policy in Scotland over several years. So to tell you how we're going to structure the webinar, we're going to give you a brief introduction to rural Scotland, because I know some of you have been here. You've had the good fortune to visit, but not all of you. We'll then tell you about the reports of Rural Scotland in Focus reports, a bit about the Rural Policy Centre itself and Scotland's Rural College, SRUC. And then the key messages from Rural Scotland in Focus 2016. And those are structured under 4 headings: changing land management, wider rural economies, policies for communities in Scotland, and then our conclusions based on the evidence we present around the need for a coherent rural strategy. And then finally, we'll be telling you about the impact of the Rural Scotland in Focus reports. So a bit about Rural Scotland itself. There's some pictures for you showing you the diversity of rural Scotland. It covers 98% of Scotland's land mass, so almost all of Scotland's land mass. And here rural is defined as settlements of less than 3,000 population. Rural Scotland is home to approximately 20% of our population. That's about 1 million people out of our 5 million population. It covers a number of sectors, perhaps the more traditional food and drink, as you would expect, also encompassing tourism, renewables, renewable energy, forestry, agriculture and fisheries, information technology, manufacturing, construction, and professional and creative industries. We've been developing the Rural Scotland in Focus report since 2010. In fact, the idea was first developed in 2008 when we put a bid internally to what was then Scottish Agriculture College for funds to develop a state of rural Scotland, if you like, taking the temperature of rural Scotland, because we realised that this evidence base didn't exist at that time. And over the years, we've seen a growing need for this report, and we're pleased to say that people were asking us in 2016, when is your report coming out? They're actually looking forward to reading it. There are 4 key elements to the report. Firstly, it's a fast track to evidence. We spend a lot of time pointing people to key evidence and pulling that together. And not only do we provide evidence, but we took the decision early on to provide commentary on key themes. So we say, so what, to those pieces of evidence. We tell you what we perceive the evidence to mean. We then pull together a compendium of resources. So there are hundreds, literally, of endnotes with hyperlinks to the original sources so that the reader can go directly to those in a very efficient way. And we have, although in each report focused on specific themes that are relevant in that year, we have also allowed for comparison over time on issues to do with demographics or housing or jobs, the wider rural economy, so that people can look at changes over time during that 6-year period. And that's given people a real insight into how rural Scotland is changing. The Rural Scotland in Focus report is one of a number of activities and projects that the Rural Policy Centre itself delivers. So it doesn't sit in isolation. The Rural Policy Centre was established in 2007 with the aim of providing independent, impartial information and analysis to others with respect to current policies and for informing the development of new policies. And our Rural Scotland in Focus report series are a key element of this process. We also produce research briefings and policy briefings on really relevant topics for policy colleagues, and we coordinate in-house consultation responses to government. We engage regularly with policy colleagues at the Scottish Parliament, in local government, and with a range of stakeholders across the country, and through national and international policy events. And you can see on the top right of the slide the 2012 Rural Scotland in Focus report there, where the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Environment was hosting a reception at his request to respond to our report in the Scottish Parliament. So we have a high profile response to the report each time it's published, and indeed in the 2016 launch event we had a panel at which MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, responded to the report. At the bottom left of the picture you can see again a room in the Scottish Parliament where the Rural Policy Centre provides the secretariat for a cross-party group on rural policy, where we bring key themes and issues to the attention of members of the Scottish Parliament and key stakeholders. And the bottom right is Dr. Jane Atherton in Russia, I believe, in Siberia, talking about the state of Scotland's rural economy. And all of this work of the Rural Policy Centre, and specifically Rural Scotland in Focus, supports Scotland's Rural College in delivering its mission, committed to excellence in the advancement, communication and translation of knowledge throughout the rural sector. It's a key passion of ours to ensure that rural evidence is translated and communicated in really clear ways to as many stakeholders as possible. And that's something we have achieved through this report. And we haven't done this on our own. Partnership working is absolutely essential for us. And here's just some of the logos. Each 2 years, when we produce the report, we have a slide like this, which shows the partners who have contributed in different ways to the report, through case studies, through providing us with data, sometimes through co-authoring chapters. And this has really helped us to make sure our evidence is up to date, and that we have multiple different sources of evidence that allow us to give really good narratives, relevant stories that are really useful for a wide range of stakeholders across Scotland, and bring together multiple perspectives which really chime with a broad range of stakeholders who now read our report. And that runs into the thousands now across Scotland, the UK and internationally. And I'll now hand over to Jane, who's going to talk about the 2016 report in particular.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I guess in terms of the introduction to the report, that one of the key things that really struck us, which was different to the 2014 report, was the political context, and really how much has changed between the publication of our 2014 report and our 2016 report. So back in spring 2015, there was an election at UK level, which returned a majority for the Conservative government. And then in May 2016, May last year, we had an election in Scotland, and the re-election of Scottish National Party SNP government under the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon, our First Minister, but without the majority that the SNP had in the previous period from 2011 to 2016. And then, of course, yes, then of course in June 2016 we had the UK referendum and the result, the vote for the UK to leave the EU, with Scotland within that referendum voting to remain, of course. So really we're in a period of quite considerable uncertainty in Scotland, particularly related to that referendum vote in 2016. So there's all of that kind of political uncertainty that forms the background to the report. In terms of the wider policy landscape in Scotland, we in 2015 had a revised government economic strategy which very much talks about a focus on inequalities and a focus on inclusive growth. We've had a big push in Scotland for community empowerment. We had a Community Empowerment Act in 2015, and also on land reform, with the kind of overarching aim is to increase access to land ownership for more people, I guess. And we have a Land Reform Act in 2016. So lots going on in terms of the wider policy landscape. Really the key theme of the 2016 report is evidence. And we argue that despite all this uncertainty, and probably because, because of this uncertainty, the centrality of evidence remains and is arguably even more important. Thinking about what we know, what we don't know, what we still need to know, and what difference that will make when we plug those evidence gaps, if you like. Why do we need to know the things we don't know? And we argue in the report that even in this period of uncertainty, there are many potential positive opportunities for rural Scotland, but making the most of these opportunities requires an adequate evidence base to inform action. So the report itself is divided into 3 key sections plus a conclusion. So what we're going to do now in the presentation is really run through the key messages from those 3 sections. I'll cover sections 1 and 2 and then hand back to Sarah for section 3. That was a section that she wrote. And Sarah will also take you through our conclusions. So the first section is called Changing Land Management, and that itself has 3 subsections. The first of which focuses on agriculture, and it's probably important to note that that was primarily authored by Stephen Thompson, who's a senior agricultural economist here in the research part of SRUC where we sit. But alongside Stephen, he drew in colleagues from our SAC consulting division. So these are farm and rural business advisors who are working out across Scotland on a commercial basis with farming and other rural business clients. So that gives a real practical industry take to the chapter, I suppose, and that's really quite important. So the first section of Changing Land Management is on agriculture. Then we look at land ownership and woodland and forestry. So first of all, just thinking about the agriculture section, in Stephen's own words, he says the purpose of this section was to open up agriculture to a wider audience, to show how the sector is changing in terms of profitability, in terms of different breeds, in terms of numbers of animals. So what this section does is really provide an overview of a range of issues that are facing the agriculture sector in Scotland, and he looks at specific sectors within the agricultural industry and what's driving change in those different sectors and what are the opportunities and challenges going forward. So what you'll see in Stephen's section of the report is a huge amount of data. He's brilliant with data and he loves data by his own admission. So there's a whole range of stuff in there about the state of the agricultural sector and the different activities within it. So again, Stephen, in his words, would argue that if you're new to agriculture or agriculture in Scotland, or if you're an expert, you'll still find something in that data that is of use to you. In terms of the main messages from the report, Stephen talks about land, the land in Scotland, the state of the land for agriculture, how land is used. And it's important to remember that 85% of Scotland is less favoured area. So this is land that has one or more challenges in terms of soil or climate or slope. So it's a really important underlying feature, if you like, to the agricultural industry, this large proportion of land that is in some respect less favoured. He talks a lot about policy in his section as a significant driver of change, not just in terms of Brexit, but also in terms of regular reforms to the common agricultural policy that we've seen over the last 20, 30, 40 years. He talks about the economic impact of agriculture. He talks about income and expenditure and how agriculture in many parts of rural Scotland underpins the rural economy, and looks at how farmers spend their money and how this affects other parts of the local economy. He looks at the people involved, the workers, what is their age profile, which sectors are dependent on seasonal or migrant workers. And then, as I said earlier, he goes through the key sectors, which you'll see appearing here, and looks at the different drivers and challenges and opportunities. And one particular sector that he focuses on within the crops part of the section is soft fruit, which is a really interesting example of a sector which is unsupported in terms of subsidies, but is regarded as being highly innovative. So maybe a possible role model for Scottish agriculture going forward post EU membership. Then, as you'll see, he talks about efficiency and really argues that driving efficiency is really critical throughout agriculture. He then has a number of themes which bring the whole section together, looking at methods, the different kinds of methods that farmers use and how efficient or how environmentally friendly they are, for example. Innovation is another key theme, and adaptation to the challenges and opportunities that farmers face. So the way he sees his section is that all of these are pieces of a jigsaw, and they come together to provide a picture of a resilient, vibrant agricultural sector. And the picture that you'll see underlying that jigsaw is actually Lagan, which is part of the Highlands of Scotland, where Stephen comes from as an author, and it's a picture of the whole community coming together at sheep shearing time to get the job done, and it's a real sense of community spirit. And you can see the picture there. So the key messages, I guess, from this section are considerable policy uncertainty, and that leads, as Stephen argues, to a drop in investment and a drop in long-term thinking, which obviously has implications for individual farms, but also for the wider rural economy. He argues that farmers and crofters need to drive changes in order to improve, whether that's to do with efficiency, whether it's to do with the overall vibrancy of the sector, whether it's to do with reducing carbon emissions. He argues that supporting the younger generation into the industry is absolutely critical for implementing new ideas, taking new approaches, but it is an unprecedented period of policy transition. He argues that agriculture has always gone through change of one sort or another, whether it's policy driven or whether it's another driver. But really, this is an unprecedented period of transition. So it's an opportunity to take stock and create a roadmap for success for Scottish agriculture. So he ends on a kind of positive note, I suppose. So that's the first part of section 1. We then move on to thinking about land ownership. And this is written by Rob McMorran, who's done a lot of work in this area with other colleagues here at SIUC. And he draws on a growing body of evidence about different land ownership patterns or land ownership types and different outcomes. So he talks about the fact that there has been some diversification of land ownership recently. In other words, a reduction in private land ownership and a trend towards more NGO or community ownership. And then he looks at the different outcomes that result from these different ownership patterns. So arguing that private estate owners tend to emphasize long-term viability and deliver economic impacts in terms of jobs, for example. If you look at NGO landowners, they tend to play a very key role in terms of conservation, for example, through national nature reserves, but also significant economic benefits relating to jobs, for example, and spend, but also social outcomes. So, for example, interpretation of the natural heritage. Community land ownership is a really hot topic in Scotland and has been for a number of years. And the evidence suggests that community land ownership can rebuild community capacity, can increase confidence, investment, employment, and importantly, reduce outmigration. But the level of these outcomes really tends to be linked with the length of time that a community has owned land, the quality of that land or that resource that they have, and also the existing capacity of the community to move towards some of these outcomes. He looks at policy shifts and how they've impacted on landowners in different ways, and encouraging them more to deliver more public benefits, and also to involve communities. And there is evidence, there's lots of good examples of land that is owned privately or private landowners drawing in communities to their activities on their estates. And he notes that all landowners face challenges, whether they're financial challenges, whether they're different perceptions amongst the public of the benefits and costs of different land ownership models, and also uncertainty. And again, Brexit is a key source of that uncertainty at the moment. he argues that new land ownership models, i.e. NGO and community ownership, can increase rural resilience, but equally proactive community engagement and partnership by private landowners can also enhance those community outcomes. So moving on to woodland and forestry, we have an aspiration in Scotland to increase cover of woodland and forestry from a current level of 18% to 25% by 2050. You can see on the map there the distribution of woodland, native and otherwise, in Scotland at the moment. And the rationale behind this drive to increase cover is to ensure that woodland and forestry contribute to delivering a whole range of outcomes, whether it be social, economic, environmental, climate change, health and well-being, all sorts of different outcomes. But in this section, David McCracken, the author, argues that there is an increasing tension between achieving that range of outcomes and also ensuring that the sector remains productive and can make a major contribution to the rural economy. And you'll see from the graphic there, it's worth almost 1 billion per year in terms of GVA to the Scottish economy. So it's significant in terms of its contribution. And Davey argues in the section that these objectives are not necessarily mutually exclusive if we think better about how we manage woodlands and forestry in Scotland now and in the future, particularly make them much more resilient to climate change. And he argues if we do that, then these other economic and social outcomes will follow naturally. So he argues that we need to have much more engagement with managers of woodlands, owners of woodlands, to encourage more native woodland and also to manage and restructure plantations. What we don't need is to debate why we need more woodland, Davey argues, and also why we should manage it better. Those are almost givens. What we have is a range of challenges to achieving these outcomes, but Davey argues in this section there's a whole range of information out there and incentives out there to encourage land managers to do this. He argues that actually what we do need is leadership. We need leadership to change attitudes and perceptions and to encourage behaviour change on the ground in order to make progress. We have too much of a sort of business as usual approach where foresters and land managers, including farmers, don't necessarily see the need to increase the resilience of forests and nor the need to integrate woodland with other land uses. So he argues that the Scottish Government has a critical role to play in working in partnership with the forestry and rural land management sector to provide collective leadership to change these attitudes and to get the kind of full range of management that is needed to get this range of objectives achieved. But again, he concludes positively and says it is possible to do. So moving on to section 2 of the report, which is looking beyond the land-based sector, which was the section that I was lead author on. What we did in this section is look at the evidence base, the existing evidence base for these wider rural businesses or businesses operating outside the land-based sector. And there is some evidence available. We know that there are about 51,000 registered SMEs in rural Scotland, which is 1/3 of Scotland's total. And if you think back, that compares to 20% of Scotland's total population. An SME, sorry, a small and medium-sized enterprise. Over 70% of these SMEs are outside the primary sector, so nearly 37,000 businesses outside the primary sector. And so we're talking about significant numbers of businesses out with the primary sector. But, and also importantly, these are only registered and they're only SMEs. So in other words, we don't know much about the non-registered businesses. We don't even know how many there are. And if we add, we think at Scottish level, there are probably double the number of registered businesses or unregistered. So if we're thinking about that in a rural context, we're probably talking about at least 100,000 SMEs. And on top of that, you've got a number of large businesses. So we're talking about a significant number of businesses, but especially if you think back to section 1 of the report where we had that slide with all the data, in comparison, the evidence we have in Scotland about these non-primary or non-land-based businesses is very limited, including about their characteristics, the needs, and the contributions they make. So this lack of evidence has led to, we argue, two false assumptions that are prevalent here in Scotland. One is that the rural economy is the same as agriculture or equates to agriculture. Clearly it doesn't. I've mentioned a number of businesses that operate outside the primary sector, and it's a significant number of businesses. And also an assumption that cities are the only engines of growth and somehow rural areas are dependent on cities. That again is a prevalent assumption that a lack of evidence has helped to generate. So what we're not saying is that we don't have any evidence. We do have some evidence. We know that in some terms of some important characteristics, rural businesses are different to urban businesses. So for example, we know proportions of businesses in rural and urban Scotland that have no employees, in other words, are sole traders. We're talking about 42% in both accessible and remote rural Scotland, but only 30 to slightly over 30% in urban Scotland. We know there are differences in terms of business survival rates, registration, deregistration rates. Rural businesses tend to have better survival rates than urban businesses, but there's a considerable amount of variation across Scotland. We know that in rural Scotland, 77% of businesses are family owned and over 40% are home based, much higher proportions than in urban Scotland. We know there are differences in terms of the barriers that businesses report to their growth. So for example, broadband, weather, transport, those kind of issues are more important to rural firms, as you might expect. We know there are differences in self-employment rates. In some parts of rural Scotland, we're talking about nearly 1 in 4 people being self-employed, compared to about 10% in urban Scotland. And we argue that this evidence suggests that businesses in rural Scotland may very well need different types of support, and importantly, support delivered in very different ways, whether it's using IT, for example. But this is only part of the story. There are lots of gaps still in our evidence. So what we conclude in this section is that we need to know more about individual businesses. We need to know about the numbers of unregistered businesses. We need to know how people get into setting up a business. Is it by choice or is it through necessity? We need to know about their future plans, how innovative they are, connectivity and how much of a challenge that is, productivity, and how they contribute in terms of different sectors in different places. We also need to know much more about the context in which they operate. Brexit is having an impact in terms of increasing uncertainty. We also have a number of new actors who are delivering rural business support at local level in Scotland, but we don't know how they interact with or don't the existing very complex rural business landscape. So we need, general business landscape or business support landscape. So we need to understand that much better. And we argue with that evidence, we can therefore challenge those two false and very damaging assumptions. We can also shape much more appropriate rural business support, and therefore we can fulfil the Scottish Government's purpose, which is to support all businesses and to build a dynamic, sustainable and inclusive economy across Scotland. We argue we can't do that unless we know what population of businesses we're looking at. Okay, so that's the end of section 2. I'll now hand back to Sarah, who will take you through section 3 and the conclusions.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. So we're now going to look at policies for rural communities in Scotland. And in this section, you'll see a question mark at the end of the title. I'm asking whether it's possible to say, when we look back over recent years, whether these policies are leading to resilient rural communities or not. Since 1999, there have been many policies and programmes and funds to support community resilience. And you'll see on the next slide what I mean by many. However, 17 years later, we do not know whether all these policies have changed the national level picture of outcomes for communities. We simply do not know. We don't have the evidence. Not we, the evidence does not exist. And this is because policies and programmes do not feed into each other. You'll see this on the next slide. Indicators change significantly with each new policy. So if you have time to look at the chapter, you'll see in the second half of it, I review all the indicators that come in with each new policy, and they very rarely refer to the previous policy. And local level evidence on a multitude of programs is not pulled together to assess progress towards national community outcomes. So all this wealth of evidence stays at a local level. So here we see a timeline of policies running from 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was established, through to the current session of the Scottish Parliament, which is running from 2016 to 2021. So each of those boxes along the top represents a session of the Scottish Parliament. And you'll see different, along the top you'll see ministerial appointments and then cabinet secretary appointments. You'll see in yellow different strategic frameworks, and then further down under the purple shading, which are government department, you'll see different projects, programs, funds, strategies that have been brought in over the years. And each of these has their own set of objectives, indicators, outcomes, action plans. Some of them are strategies. And you'll see when you read the section that they vary in terms of the rigour of the sets of indicators and follow-up of evaluation that comes with each of them. But it's deliberate that the boxes don't join up in this diagram. And this has implications for us, knowing or not knowing whether these policies collectively have enhanced the resilience of communities in Scotland. This evidence shows the urgent need to develop a framework for pulling evidence together, because evidence does exist, it's just very disparate. We need to be much smarter in using what we already know, what exists. A lot of evaluations have been carried out, but the evidence sits in many separate places. And we also need to identify gaps for further evidence gathering. And in the chapter, we have given examples of using evidence more smartly, identifying gaps and identifying ways to address those gaps around mental health, fuel poverty and housing. And we've pointed to examples of others doing that. And you remember the slide at the beginning showing partnership working. We've brought in examples from others showing how they have generated evidence. And the reason that's urgent is because we need a clear picture of what has changed and why it's changed in order to know what to stop and what to continue in terms of different policies and measures. Because in rural Scotland, as we said at the beginning, there's 1 million people spread over 98% of the landmass. It's 1/5 of Scotland's population. So there's always a challenge of gathering data for a small proportion of the population who are dispersed over a large landmass. And that's been a problem for many years. But based on the evidence that we've presented and in our 3 previous reports, so for 6 years now, we argue that it's no longer acceptable to say that it's too difficult to collect data in and for rural areas, for example, for indicators around poverty. And we can talk about that more if you would like to. So there's a strong case developing really for saying the status quo is no longer acceptable, because it has implications in that we still don't know what's happened to all the investment over the past 16 years. So we move on to the conclusions of the overall report. So we look forward based on the evidence that we've presented and ask what next for rural Scotland. So in this report, we've taken you through the drivers and directions of travel for Scotland's multiple agricultural and land use sectors, rural businesses, as Jane has outlined, and their rural communities. And as with the previous report in 2014, this report, the evidence we've presented, points to the need for an overarching rural strategy, which is coherent, inclusive, and measurable, and builds on the innovation and creativity of those in rural Scotland. The words here are all important and reflect the evidence we presented in 2014. Coherent in bringing together those multiple strands, inclusive in that it recognises the innovation and creativity, and at the same time the poverty and disadvantage that currently remains in rural Scotland, and is measurable, that goals are set which are measurable. We set out in the report 3 aims of the strategy. The first is to set out a vision for rural Scotland and how the different rural specific interventions deliver to that vision. And in the report we set out a range of rural specific interventions, policies that are targeted at rural, and say there's a need to assess the extent to which those that are designed for rural are actually delivering to a vision for rural Scotland. At the moment we have statements around Scotland up to about 2011 for what rural Scotland should look like, but since then there haven't been any vision statements. So we don't know what sort of rural Scotland we're supposed to be moving towards. The second aim is to monitor, evaluate and review how national policies are supporting or hampering delivery of that rural vision, potentially using a type of rural proofing approach, which is used in other countries. A rural lens, I think it's called in parts of Canada, where national policies are checked for how they are going to impact on rural areas. And thirdly, to develop ways of measuring progress in order to track how rural is delivering on its vision and how it's delivering to the outcomes of something called the National Performance Framework, which was introduced in Scotland 10 years ago and is intended to focus on the purpose of government and delivery of 16 national outcomes. So we would want to, within this strategy, develop ways of seeing how well rural is delivering to those national outcomes too. And that vision and progress would be underpinned by evidence. We've said already that evidence is central to this report and to the 3 previous reports. We look back to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament and to a particular strategy called the Social Justice Strategy. And there's a quote there that says, "Evidence is critical because Scotland will know if we are moving towards a fairer, more just nation." And I think that Scotland knows is a very compelling phrase and one worth reaching for. And the only way Scotland will know is through having a sound and rigorous evidence base. And that's something we conclude in our 2016 report. And if we look forward from the report, which was launched in November last year, and say, well, how do we continue having an impact? How did we have an impact through our previous reports, and how do we continue to do that? We've structured this final slide according to the different stakeholders with whom we engage. Firstly, the Scottish Parliament. We mentioned, you'll see a picture on the right there, a parliamentary reception, which was held in 2012 at the Cabinet Secretary's request to respond to the 2012 report. So we engage regularly with ministers and members of the Scottish Parliament, with the cross-party groups, with parliamentary committees where we are called as witnesses to give evidence, and at our launch events we involve MSPs on the panel. We don't set up to be us and them, where we are presenting evidence in a combative way or an adversarial way. We seek to work together to support ministers and members and those providing evidence in a way that helps them do their job, because we all want the best for rural Scotland. So we are doing that in a collaborative and supportive way, whilst obviously observing boundaries of impartiality and apolitical stance in our work. We also work with Scottish Government colleagues and meet regularly with them to inform government policy analysts and researchers, and also hear what their priorities are. We meet regularly with them, not just around the time of publishing our reports, but throughout each year. We meet again regularly, spending time with Scottish stakeholders of non-governmental organisations, those involved in land management, development trusts at local level, and other academics, ensuring that we're listening as well as communicating information and evidence. Not only in Scotland, also at the UK level, and Jane is a member, the Scottish member of the UK Rural Policy and Practitioners Research Group. So we're really keen that we understand the UK picture on many issues, and also that they understand the perspective coming from Scotland. And international stakeholders are very important to us, as you are today. We've engaged with parliamentary bodies as well as development agencies in Sweden, Finland, Australia and Canada, and we're very excited to do that because we learn very much from these engagements, and we hope also that we raise the profile of the work that we do here in the Rural Policy Centre. So we'd like to conclude the formal part of our presentation just now, but obviously depending how you want to take things forward, Orthist and colleagues obviously be open to further discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Jane and Professor Sarah. I have one question coming from P. Chamberlain, and he is asking, given the high percentage of family and home-based small-scale and medium enterprises in Scotland, are there evidence to support business succession in rural Scotland because of the high percentage of family and home-based SMEs in Scotland? Or are there policies or programs that have been successful in supporting succession processes in Scotland?
Good question. An interesting question. Not that I'm aware of at all. We have colleagues working at another institution in Edinburgh, actually, who do a lot of work on family-owned businesses particularly, and a number of other colleagues looking at home-based businesses, but I'm not aware of any particular succession policies. And I think I would really argue it's an area where we need to know more. I think even in agriculture there isn't, certainly recently, a lot of work done in this area. So it's an area where we need further research. Interestingly, the key press headline, I suppose, from the report was the high proportion, I think it was 1 in 5 farmers who were surveyed in a survey that we ran here at SRUC. 1 in 5 were considering retiring from agriculture because of the uncertainty of Brexit. So I think that's almost a flavour of how uncertainty can impact on that situation. And obviously those high numbers, 77% family owned, is really high. So I think it's definitely an area where we'd like to do more research. Yeah.
Add to that, there's a program called the Rural Leadership Program, which is funded by Scottish Enterprise, and within that there is some. Scottish Enterprise is one of 2 economic development agencies in Scotland, and within that there is training for business leaders, generally small, micro enterprises actually. And one of the areas that I know they discuss, if that's raised by the business person themselves, is around succession when they review their own enterprise. But that would be something that the individual business person would bring to light and say they want to discuss, rather than it being part of the training program. But it's certainly something, as you say, because of the age profile in the farming sector, for example, it's something that's been recognised as an issue for a long time. And I think there have been various discussions around succession planning, but I don't see there's been a national programme around that.
And I guess in the context not just of the agricultural population ageing, but the rural population generally ageing. There is sort of anecdotal evidence of people in their 50s and 60s moving to rural areas, or perhaps moving earlier in life, but later in life setting up a business. And I guess there's questions around how the longevity, I guess, of those businesses when the owner is already older.
Okay, all right. I think it's well answered.
Okay.
We also have another question coming from Norman, and he is asking, could you please outline your secretariat role with the MSP Rural Committee? That's, if I may interpret it my own way, like the municipal, state, or provincial rural committees, like their roles outlined with your secretariat.
There's a distinction, to make clear. So we provide the secretariat for the cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament on rural policy. So cross-party groups are slightly different to committees. So I guess just to go back a step as well, in the Scottish Parliament there are a number of committees. At the moment, in this current session, we have 2 committees that are dealing with rural issues. One is rural economy and connectivity, and the other is environment, climate change and land reform. So they're the committees. Our role is in relation to a cross-party group. And again, there are a number of cross-party groups. As Secretariat, we meet with the co-conveners of the group, who are, you can guess from the name, from the different political parties. We meet with them over the summer recess and discuss with them topics that they feel are particularly of interest to MSPs and wider stakeholders, and agree a programme of usually 4 meetings for this forthcoming year, from sort of September time to June. And then it's our job to not run the meetings, to set up the meetings, to deal with invites, but also importantly to find speakers or presenters who can talk knowledgeably about that particular topic. So the aim of the group is to inform members of the Scottish Parliament, but it's not just members of the Scottish Parliament that come to the group, it's very many stakeholders, whether it's enterprise companies or local government people and voluntary sector groups. Health, yeah. So we've covered a whole range of topics, from transport to housing to broadband to supply chains to Brexit. The next meeting we have is on the 7th of March, and that's looking at rural mental ill health. So we do cover lots of different things. There's more information on the Rural Policy Centre website if you want to know more.
So that's the secretariat function that we provide, and as Jane said, if you go on to the website you can find cross-party group, and then so those are non-legislative, and those happen generally in the evening after the parliamentary business has concluded. And as I mentioned, we also act as witnesses to the parliamentary scrutiny committees that Jay mentioned, and those are legislative. That's where they're scrutinising legislation as it's going through different processes. So that's a different function that we have.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Ray, and he is also asking, in order to estimate the impacts of a rural policy or program, should there be a need for a counterfactual, let's say, model? That's like what would happen if there wasn't any rural policy or program? And could you suggest some ways you might develop a counterfactual scenario?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I think we need a bit of time to think about that more fully. Is the question what would happen if there isn't a rural policy? Because what we're saying at the moment is there is not a rural policy.
Yes, yeah. If if there aren't any rural policies or programs in place, how are we going to model the development of our rural communities?
It's something actually I've been thinking about recently, because we're potentially going to be doing some work for a private sector energy company who are using some of the money generated through a wind farm to provide funding for new and existing small businesses in a particular part of Scotland, and they want to evaluate the impact of their fund. So I was thinking, well, actually, what would be great would be to know what would happen in that particular area without the 250,000, I think it's going to be per year. What would be how many businesses would there be, or how many new businesses would start in that area without that kick-started funding? But how you actually do that?
I mean, I would turn the question around, perhaps, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I might not be, and say we already have the counterfactual, because we have no rural policy at the moment. So we have a lot of evidence from the past 16 years of no rural policy. And our reports, the past 4 reports, have stated that, and we've been at a number of stakeholder events over the years where people have said, without a rural policy, you have this strategy and this strategy working against each other. You have these objectives being missed. You have a lack of coherence between this strategy and this strategy. So we have a lot of evidence of the counterfactual already. So what would be great is if a rural strategy then came in, we could actually then map the impact, because we have a lot of evidence already of what it's like without one. We have something called the land use strategy, which is intended to draw some things together. We have a national planning framework, which again is intended to draw things together. So there's hints of policy coherence, none of which particularly focus around rural. There is the Scottish Rural Infrastructure Programme plan. Yeah. There's also something potentially quite exciting called an Islands Bill, which is focused on the Scottish Islands and a local authority area that has a number of islands within its geographical area. So that could give some coherence around rural areas that are islands based. So we might see, well, does that actually start to become an islands strategy? So could we start to see a difference? Will it link up other strategies around transport or health or education within it, or will it sit separately again? So I would argue we have the counterfactual already. We have some potential examples maybe around the Islands Bill and 1 or 2 others that might start to hint at some coherence around rural. But if we got a rural strategy, we could then do the analysis that's being talked about.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I think it's well answered, Ray. Okay, all right. So I'll move on to my next question, which is coming from Diane. And she is asking, has there been any exploration of the role of local schools in rural sustainability?
Local schools.
Local schools in rural, like local schools in rural municipalities, in terms of the sustainability of rural areas.
There was an organisation looking at exactly that issue that was Scotland based. I don't know whether they still exist or not. We used to have in Scotland, or was this England, a presumption against the closure. It was Scotland.
Yeah.
A presumption against the closure of rural schools.
That's changed.
Yeah.
Need to be careful. I would say the short answer is no.
Yeah.
There are different views on. Okay, start again. The central importance of the school to the survivability, particularly of smaller, remoter rural communities, is not questioned. That's recognised, and quite a lot of that is symbolic as well as as real. You know, once the school goes, then that educational resource is lost, and therefore the attraction for young families disappears. And we've seen in some community land, community-owned areas, the increase in the number of children in the school means there's more young families coming in. So there's a kind of positive knock-on effect where the school role increases, and that increases the number of families then being attracted to the area. So there's studies around the significance of the school to the survivability of more fragile communities. There's also been research and debate around the fact that the schools tend to function only as a school largely, whereas they could be a resource, a multifunctional resource, a community hub, for example, for older people or people with disabilities. However, there are policy and I don't know what you'd call it. There are constraints, system constraints on flexibility around building use, permissions for building use, which make that a good idea in theory but less possible in practice. So there are frustrations around inflexibility of building use, and we're often pointed to Scandinavia or the Netherlands as countries where that works really well, where a village school is a multi-use resource, and therefore it's able to thrive much more. So I don't think we've got a coherent answer, because I'm not sure there's a coherent, there's been a coherent response around that.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I'll also I also have my own questions for you, Dr. Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've looking at the demographics of our rural places. We are all witnessing rural arts migration, and a recent release by the Census Canada points out that the Canadian population is aging, and just as we all know from the trends in the reports, it reveals that there's been rural arts migration in terms of people leaving smaller centers to bigger centers, which is leaving rural places and their population kind of giving it an aged population. So do we have any policies in place in terms of trying to solve this kind of menace happening in most of our rural places across board, like mostly in the EU and also in North America?
I can't comment for the wider EU.
Yeah, I mean, we have at EU level, we have a program called LEADER, which encourages bottom-up projects, basically, and across Scotland there will be a number of those that are particularly targeted at young people, and getting young people, youth centres, and getting young people or supporting young entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. So there'll be sort of ad hoc, local level projects, in the same way that there'll be projects that are specifically targeted at also at our ageing population.
There's also in Scotland there are 32 local authority areas, so that's local government areas, 14 of which are rural local authorities, and within local authorities there are strategies and plans which recognise the local demographics. And so in rural areas, as you rightly say, there are demographic challenges with ageing populations and outmigration of young people. So many of the strategies at local authority level will have actions that seek to address the needs of the older population and seek to enhance for example, the employment opportunities for younger people, and seek to address housing need for younger people as well. So housing and transport are key issues, as well as employment opportunities, training and apprenticeships. So local government plays quite a key role, and they work in partnership with other agencies, some of which will be local to their area and some will be national. And there are some national initiatives as well within something called the Programme for Government, which seeks to address, which seeks to provide additional apprenticeships for young people, looking at housing needs and so on. So it's a case with all of these, looking at how well they fit rural areas, how well they work for dispersed rural populations, where the fact that, for example, rural young people are further away from centres, so how do they actually make use of any opportunities that are being provided if they don't have transport and the public transport is very poor. Similarly, for older people, if services are being provided but they don't have transport, how can they access them? So for us, there are initiatives being made by local government, their partners, and by national government, and it's about tailoring those to the specific geography of rural areas that remains a challenge.
I think just to add to that, young people was a topic we tackled in the cross-party group, and I guess one of the key messages was there are all of these practical challenges, transport, housing, employment for young people, but actually quite often young people don't have a voice locally or nationally to articulate those kind of challenges. So quite a lot of the discussion we had at that cross-party group was, how do we, actually we were very keen to get that particular cross-party group dominated by young people rather than by those of us who are older. So I think there's an even bigger debate around how we engage with young people. We have something called the Scottish Youth Parliament, who have members of the Scottish Youth Parliament across Scotland, but actually the extent to which young people then engage with those, or even know about indeed those members, I think is an important question as well.
You, was it the 2014 report? Yeah, in the 2014 Rural Scotland in Focus report, Jane and Ellie Brodie co-authored a section on migration of young people. And one of the things you wrote about was the positive aspect of youth out migration. Yeah. Because young people could go and experience the world and bring those experiences back. So there's also a need to be careful about stereotyping youth out migration as something totally negative at all times, I think.
And added to that, about stereotyping the ageing population as being very negative, because whilst a lot of older people will increase demand on health and social care services, in actual fact, many older people, maybe the younger old people, do want to keep working, they want to set up a business, or they want to contribute in terms of voluntary. If you look at some of the local level development trusts and leader groups that I referred to before, locally there are a lot of people who are coming into those groups with an immense amount of knowledge and skills, adding to community capacity. So,
okay, all right, okay, thank you. Okay, I think looking at my chat boxes and my Q&A box as well, I don't think we have any other questions for Dr. Sarah and Professor Sarah and Dr. Jane. So I will say thank you to Dr. Jane and Professor Sarah for presenting to us today on our Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar series. And we will say thank you to all our attendees for today's webinar as well. And we're looking forward to seeing you in our next webinar on February 22nd. Yeah, that'll be.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, so we will take this opportunity to thank Dr. Jane Atherton and Professor Sarah Skerrit for having the time to present on our Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.